From Software sits alongside the greatest known names in current video game development, and unlike most others, they seem to be there for a favorable reason. After being unceasingly battered by years of poorly made but well-monetized live services and otherwise great games that unfortunately launch under a release it now, patch it later philosophy, games like Elden Ring only continue to stand out as the treasures that they are. I can chew up as much time as I want pointing out that some weapons didn't receive as much love as I would have wanted, or being sour over running into my 9th Erdtree avatar this week, or being the 87,000th channel to talk about how inexorably fucked lightning is, but Elden Ring still remains one of my favorite games I've ever played, which I think is the truth for most people that criticize it. Besides, I'd much rather be the 97,000th channel to talk to you about the necessities of owning a VPN instead. NordVPN encrypts all your internet activity and keeps your data, personal information, and even search history hidden from ISPs that pretend they're interested in keeping your data private but really aren't. Even if there's some courtesy on their website that says they'll never sell your data to advertisers, doesn't mean they just won't do it. A beast should know better than to trust what a hunter says, alright? The way I use my own internet connection is my goddamn business, and that doesn't stop being true just because I'm in public, at an airport, at a Denny's or something. Public venues are rife with cyber criminals these days, and most of the time you'll end up going hours or even days at a time without even knowing you've been hit. If you sign up for an exclusive 2-year deal using my link in the description, you get 4 free months of extra service, and there's a 30-day money-back guarantee, so if you have any second thoughts about using the service, you've got plenty of time to make that decision. It seems more and more games are releasing under the necessity of an internet connection, prioritizing online experiences at the expense of a quality single-player campaign, and some even require a connection to so much as play the game by yourself, and by simply not following suit, they ended up giving a lot of people the uniquely satisfying single-player experience they were craving. Fromsoft has been sticking either to the same or a very similar formula of world building and combat for a good 15 years now, and it's only continued to pay off in the long run, as their games developed in that style have all garnered cult followings that have only grown over time. The theme of exploring some sad old dude's castle, of course, lends itself to a single-player experience, which has been the largest focus of games like Dark Souls, but that's not to say certain elements of player interaction have never been present. If you're playing online, PvP is managed by a list of online-only items that allow players to cross paths with one another via world invasions. You can either invade the worlds of other players or leave a sign somewhere in the game that invites others to invade your own. In the first Dark Souls, this was one of many ways the player could obtain an item known as humanity, which is a powerful consumable used to gain a large amount of health while also boosting various resistance, decreasing the likelihood of being cursed, and a bunch of other interesting effects that make it one of the most coveted items in the game. PvP can also be spiced up a bit by joining covenants that allow you to invade or be invaded by players with certain conditions. The Blade of the Darkmoon Covenant, for instance, allows you to invade players who have sinned by using the Blue Eye Orb. Joining the Gravelord's Servant Covenant allows you to place a specific soul sign that drastically increases enemy difficulty for 3 random players in that location, and in order to revert their world back to normal, they have to find the sign you placed, invade you, and kill you. These types of covenants have been a staple in Dark Souls, whether you're hunting down sinners in Blade of the Darkmoon Covenant, or invading those who intrude into the woods of Farron as a loyal watchdog of the keep. Joining a covenant can let you participate in the PvP aspect of these games in completely new ways, all while making sure they remain anchored in a mostly single-player experience. This is more or less how Fromsoft has handled multiplayer aspects in most of their games, and although the items you use to access it will appear differently in every game, the formula itself has maintained an impressive level of consistency, which makes it that much more peculiar that the presence of covenants in Elden Ring is completely absent. Like other games before it, PvP in Elden Ring has become more popular among the community as the main game loses its excitement. Despite multiple large changes such as the Colosseum update and the recent patch 1.10 that drastically altered things like poise and online play specifically, a lot of people still feel like the game's multiplayer environment is missing out on some extremely important elements, especially since a world this large has everything to gain from it. But if you've been playing since the beginning, you know it wasn't always this way. Fromsoft's track record has been carried pretty hard by how they approach the single-player experience. Every game they've put out since Demon Souls has been a masterclass in show-don't-tell storytelling. It's one big delectable content burger with the meat patty of world building cooked and seasoned to perfection, topped off with the lettuce of atmosphere, the tomatoes of visual design, and, appropriately, the cheese of combat. But Elden Ring's burger tasted a little different, kinda like someone tried to save inventory by using weak old buns. This is Elden Ring 1.0, and I don't think any of us remember just how broken this piece of shit was at launch. Half the quest lines had no conclusions, arcane scaling didn't even work, mounting torrent triggered a 1% chance of your character air fucking empty space for 20 seconds before collapsing of exhaustion. Any semblance of playability in PvP had to take the backseat for a good few months to make room for some much needed refinement. But that was still at a point in time where people were either too new to the game to care about PvP, or just assumed it was going to be shit forever and went straight to Nexus to download one of the page's 270 reshade presets. Elden Ring 1.0 technically wasn't open to the public. Patch 1.02 shipped out February 25th, the day after the game was released, so the only people out there who really had access to true vanilla were those who received review copies. Some text adjustments were made for certain languages, frame rates no longer shit the bed when you wanted to travel on horseback, balance adjustments, whatever the fuck that's supposed to mean, and a bunch of other random notes that seem pretty vague compared to what we usually get today. Of course, 1.02 still had obvious problems. Some of the quest lines still weren't finished, arcane scaling still wasn't there, and although PvP was by some stretch of the definition tolerable, it still came with its own issues, like the infamous Deathblight exploit, where casting Fire's Deadly Sin and then using the skill of the Eclipse Shotel would apply a Deathblight effect to the radius around you. And this was obviously not intentional because it could fill entire status meters over the span of 1 or 2 seconds. The single-player experience had enough problems on its own, such as certain NPCs not being able to be summoned for boss fights, or important items not even dropping how they should, but for those who wanted to get their feet wet with a few duels, a patch really couldn't come soon enough. This would set the wheels in motion for the rise of what I think might be the single most infamous weapon Fromsoft has ever created. 1.03 saw a lot of important changes. Some of them were favored among the community, most of them weren't, and a couple managed to elicit both reactions at the same time, impressively enough. Namely the arcane scaling fix that finally brought weapons like the Reduvia, Eleonora's Pole Blade, and all the rot weapons it took you 5 playthroughs to pay attention to up to par with the rest of the game's arsenal. People were very thankful that this change finally happened, as it was the first bit of proof that the player base was actually being listened to, but it didn't take more than a couple days for the PvP environment to feel the other side of the inevitably double-edged sword. Once word got out that arcane scaling was actually working as intended, 2 particular weapons rose to power so immediately that clips exist of people still attempting the Deathblight glitch after it was patched out, only to end up getting humiliated by one of these 2 weapons. The transition from one meta to another was instant. It barely took people a couple hours after the patch release to figure out that these weapons were as good as they were. This inevitably opened the road to status builds being not only viable, but downright oppressive on certain weapons, to such an amusing extent that wiki comment sections of these weapons are filled with various unsuccessful attempts to bypass the profanity filter. I can't even double check the base damage on the cross Naginata without the non-zero chance of Hypervillain93 calling me a narcissistic F-slur that enjoys ruining games. And I'm only one of those things. 1.03 was the same patch that dropped a pretty heavy sledgehammer on weapons like Sword of Night and Flame, but it also fixed a well-known bug that turned the Erdtree Great Shield into a self-sustaining arbalest. And I was just reminded right now as I'm reading through the patch notes, bitch didn't even have its own nighttime themes, so like, what the hell? It's not like 1.03 was designed to make people as mad as possible or anything. There's some good shit in there that I think we forgot about over time, but to a lot of people, the update really only replaced one shitty tactic with an arguably more disparaging shitty tactic, because this one was by design. It was becoming apparent to a lot of people that enjoying the game in a somewhat competitive way was only looking more unrealistic, and the excitement of the single-player experience slowly gave way to disappointment once people started voicing significant problems they had with how Elden Ring handles its open world. Despite its visual design and storytelling pretty much having no equal in terms of how impressive it is, this was a song and dance a large portion of the player base was already familiar with, leading to general fatigue setting in even quicker than their previous games. We went from Waterfowl Dance being cruel and unusual punishment to literally coming up with tier lists that rank the ways you can counter the attack based on how funny it is over the course of like 2 months. Yes, I made that up, and no, you can't use that idea because oh my god, that's fucking brilliant. I'm totally doing that. Regardless, people were slowly beginning to hone in on the online atmosphere as the main game started to lose its luster, and subsequently the already high mountain of complaints on how things were balanced for PvP specifically only got larger and larger as that continued to happen. 1.04 brought a few decent changes to the table, like making colossal weapons quicker, increasing damage on various weapons like Grafted Blade, Devourer Scepter, and colossal weapons across the board, and shortening the player animation of madness being afflicted. If anyone remembers this patch, it actually ended up being controversial for completely different reasons. The changes to colossal weapon speed were somewhat welcome, and the Great Shield Talisman being nerfed on Great Shields fooled people into thinking they were finally addressing the emerging wall meta, but then you would keep scrolling down. Almost every single sorcery and incantation received some sort of buff that made it deal more damage, or easier to use, or cost less FP, or some combination of the three. This patch was cool and all, sure. It added a lot of viability to some previously neglected spells that didn't have good recovery times, or just ended up being ignored because there was something better. But looking at everything the update entailed, it didn't take long for people to realize a power creep was starting to emerge. It was starting to become obvious that Fromsoft was fully intent on prioritizing the single-player experience, and seeing how the game was barely over 3 months old at this point, I don't think anyone would really disagree with that approach, since the game was still fresh to a majority of people. Getting one-tapped by some dude's pit bull because it somehow inflicted bleed 57 times in a row is an issue that requires at least some attention. But the sudden uptick in buffs provided to players really started to put PvP in an awkward position. Some abilities were just flat-out one-shots 100% of the time without even needing to build around them that much, making most PvP encounters really anticlimactic. They were certainly listening, but it was getting more difficult to tell which crowd they were listening to, especially when updates would come out that took care of maybe 2 of the 9 abilities people were set over. Did Rivers get nerfed in 1.06 because of how ever-present it was in every facet of online interaction, or did it get nerfed because someone figured out they could lay down enough damage to kill Mog before his first knee heal? Other changes in this update, like decreasing the active iframes of Bloodhound Step, seemed to be praised across the board since its problems extended well into both environments, and the faster motion of many of the heavier weapon classes seemed indicative of them finally heading in a direction that suggested some attention to PvP in the future, and at this point, it desperately needed it. By the time the nerfs came through, there was a massive portion of people online that already adapted to a Rivers meta. It was still a guarantee that you'd run into one of these virgins every 15 minutes, but players eventually adjusted to the fact that shit like this was just going to be inevitable, and soon enough, like 30 different hard counters for it started to circulate. Blood Boon Ritual ironically saw even more use, only as a countermeasure to prevent closing distance instead of a general fuck everything I win button. Even basic ashes like Golden Parry and Endure were enough to mitigate a lot of the pressure, and people eventually just started figuring out that Rivers, like most other weapons, was easily countered by knowing how to play the goddamn game. The only reason I point this out is because this had a lot to do with the general attitude towards Fromsoft at the time, and that they just didn't seem to care about the fact that Elden Ring's PvP was practically held together with tape and staples. Abilities like Swarm of Flies and Flame of the Redmanes crossing the entire span of the average YouTuber's tier list in a single patch pressed a small worry onto players that certain aspects of PvP were being adjusted in a way that affected the entire game, and not just online play. This isn't inherently a bad approach with abilities that are considered overpowered in both environments, but most weapons and spells in the game usually just aren't. Rivers and Bloodhound Step were anomalies that needed to be looked at, but most others have a tendency to overperform in one setting and underperform in the other, which means giving a speed buff to colossal weapon animations has a very obvious intention. This is a pretty dangerous way to maintain game balance, as it started to embitter the player base a bit because now people had a perfectly valid reason to blame others who played the game a certain way for their favorite nuke spell being next on the chopping block. Continuing down the road of this scorched earth approach would only serve to harm the game further, and after a long stride of patience from the game's fans, From finally demonstrated that they, in fact, were keenly aware of this. Final damage rate param was a brand new feature 1.07 brought to the table that allowed weapons, skills, and magic to all have separate scaling in online play. It was finally here. Kind of. It wasn't perfect, but it could all be fixed with time, and some of it could stand to wait, because online play was then faced with yet another problem. So much attention was given to things like Rivers, Bloodhound Step, and Swarm of Flies that it allowed a silent but growing plague to continue lying dormant under the fingernails of PvP. Great Spears. Specifically status Great Spears. Specifically power stancing Vikes. You're a cunt if you run this in PvP, by the way. Spears already had a pretty firm hold on PvP because the reach of weapons like the pike and the lance were constantly prone to being underestimated, but the gradual nerfing of PvP's biggest gripes cleared the way for weapons like the Cross Naginata and Vike's War Spear to rise even further into power. This brought us a step or two closer to understanding why PvP felt as slanted as it did. Ashes of War took a slight damage nerf across the board in PvP, in addition to giving increased poise damage to the normal attacks of all weapons. In the game as a whole, the speed of colossal swords and weapons were further increased, great shield and hammer talismans were buffed, guard penetration for sickles and scythes were also increased, and even bleed got a well-deserved nerf at the time. On the surface, the intent here is obviously to discourage passive gameplay to combat the newly established meta of hiding behind a shield and poking things, but these changes also highlighted something else. There was a growing power gap that existed between certain weapon classes. The poise rating for pretty much all heavier weapon types were given upward adjustments, and although colossal weapons weren't nearly as dominant as their great spear cousins, the recent adjustments were more than enough for players to finally start considering their value in PvP settings. Take into account that range is also a huge reason why spears and great spears have been a top preference for so long, and the power gap between smaller and larger weapons is now starting to widen into a canyon. And I personally think that if it weren't for the sudden shift away from passive gameplay, a lot of us would have never even seen it. Daggers and fists are all but completely obsolete at this point. Nagakiba becomes the top pick for light weapons simply because it's the only one that even comes close to contending with its heavier and longer competitors. Moonveil is still here for some fucking reason, but all these issues were still under the promise of closer attention being paid to online play in the future. All players really had to hear were the magic words separate PvP scaling, and suddenly, at least for a time, everything felt fine again. Some of the excitement would of course dissolve under the pressure of being victim to 27 different status builds, but that single ember of hope was enough to get people interested again. And I feel like that interest was something from anticipated, because in preparation for certain announcements, they would have wanted as many eyes on them as possible. The Colosseum update was something that couldn't have happened without the previous patch, and once the update was announced, it became really clear why they suddenly took the avenue they did. This update without a separate way to balance PvP experiences would have been a clusterfuck, but just to reinforce the goodwill they've cultivated, the first thing they did on the day of the update was nerf Kari and Slicer. It was also around this time where From dedicated some attention to the more intricate facets of combat, such as taking a look at crouching R1s, specifically how quick they were compared to other attacks on some weapons, and why that was understandably an issue to a lot of people since these weapons are kinda supposed to be slow. There's also a change that reduces the poise damage of hammers, great hammers, and colossal weapons, which aside from the direction of the adjustment is the exact same change they made on the previous patch, and I thought that was kinda funny, so I decided to mention it. You can choose between 3 different modes in the Colosseum, being 1v1, free-for-all, and team battles that can house up to 6 players. I personally find team battles to be the most fun because it forces you to really think about what your build is capable of in an environment where other people are depending on you. And the only experience I have in any competitive game is as a support, so of course you're gonna like this mode, you fucking scrub. Idiot. Each mode has its own ways of having fun. I've noticed a lot of different weapons and abilities that normally wouldn't perform well in PvP absolutely stomp 3 different people in free-for-all just because you took advantage of the fact that their attention isn't on you. The 3 Colosseums were placed in Limgrave, Caelid, and Leyndell, which I think was really smart on From's part because it reinforces the idea that characters of a certain level and certain builds are gonna participate in the same location. Ideally, Limgrave is where most people will start out, but the Caelid Colosseum permits the use of Spirit Ashes, which is kinda cool if you want to roleplay as a Pokemon trainer for 7 seconds before the other person's summon inevitably starts attacking you instead. And eventually you make your way to the Royal Colosseum where all the sweats hang out. No red flasks, no summons, 3 minutes. Kill each other. It still takes a good 15 minutes to find a match in the Limgrave Colosseum on certain playlists, and I still have trouble getting into 2v2 matches without using a password, but that's just the nature of duo queuing. It ultimately depends on the level your character is, time of day, how general your online settings are, so on and so forth. I tried to capture good footage for Colosseum fights, and I think I got maybe 4 matches in total over the course of 3 hours, 2 of which were just do-overs of the same fucking dude. And I still suck goat balls at PvP, so barely any of that footage was actually presentable. Finally, when I got got up to fix something to eat and had the text "please wait until all combatants are assembled" burned into my vision for half a second, I decided maybe this wasn't the best use of my time. I've been pretty vocal throughout the history of my Elden Ring arc on YouTube that I've never cared too much for PvP outside of dueling with friends, but I was pleasantly surprised by the build variety I kept running into. Combat was definitely a little more tedious if someone was power stancing Vikes or something stupid, but running into the same weapon multiple times in a row almost never seemed to happen to me. Maybe players just fight with a bit more dignity in the Colosseum or something. Or maybe I just got lucky, I don't know. It's going to be From's tradition to prioritize the single-player elements of their games, since that's been in line with their track record for the past 15 years, and even with earlier games like Ninja Blade and Kingsfield. But it's relieving to see that won't mean other facets of what people appreciate about these games won't end up falling to the wayside. It's never going to be perfect, and it'll never meet the demands of everyone that plays it, but simply showing that you care is more than enough reason for people to get behind it, and I think that's been proven with how From has shifted the general attitude towards their PvP in such a positive direction. Things like status builds will always reign supreme, great spears will probably always be a top pick, and that's for better or for worse. And I think if Fromsoft wants to really hone in on some of the larger grievances left within the community, addressing status builds would likely be their next big focus. I'd really like to see some adjustments made to some PvP exclusive status ailments like Madness and Deathblight, because I've always been of the mind that if they only affect other players, then it wouldn't be too much of a stretch to change how they work in PvP settings and still remain friendly for like lore purposes and stuff. Specifically, any status that directly takes away player control, such as locking you in an animation for 2 to 3 seconds while leaving you open to whatever your opponent feels like throwing at you, just feels demoralizing. I feel like Dark Souls 3's Frostbite effect would be really comfortably implemented here, where being affected with sleep just makes every action you do consume 30% more stamina, or give Madness a poison effect for FP as a hard counter to people who are over-reliant on magic spam and weapon skills. I'm not sure how constructive these suggestions are, but I feel like inhibiting movement this directly in a game mode that focuses on things like timing and spatial knowledge makes for an unhealthy PvP environment. It understandably makes a lot of people frustrated, so I think if From wants to take the next big step towards creating an even healthier environment for PvP, this is the avenue I would personally consider. Obviously not these changes exactly, those are just the ramblings of a backseat developer with a YouTube channel, but a focus in some direction that improves player control is something I think everyone would be welcome to. The truth is, improvement like this should be praised, especially when it's such a rarity that game companies actually reinforce their words with actions. Seeing how they've turned this ship around has made me exponentially more excited for the eventual release of Shadow of the Erdtree, because they've shown that even with lesser appreciated aspects of their games, they're still willing to take shit seriously. I've never been good at writing outros, so I'm just gonna leave this where it's at, and hope you guys are looking forward to some Armored Core content, because that's what I'm